Chosen ones. The ghost finally left footprints that Tuesday afternoon. 23 of the most battle-hardened operators in existence took a synchronized step backward when you stopped pretending to be normal for exactly 47 seconds. The decorated officer's voice cracked like a teenager's when he whispered those 3 words that would haunt the Pentagon's most classified vaults forever. Sir, that's illegal. Not impossible, not incredible, but illegal. Because in their world of rules and ranks and regulations, what you possess shouldn't exist. You magnificent, untraceable anomaly. You are walking classified document that nobody has clearance to read. They had protocols for everything. Nuclear threats, alien contact, cyber warfare, biological weapons, contingency plans stacked on contingency plans, reaching to the ceiling of bunkers that don't officially exist. But they had nothing, absolutely nothing, for what they witnessed when you operated at 2% capacity on a random Tuesday, barely trying, just existing in your natural state for once. The room dropped 10 degrees, and it wasn't the air conditioning. Their entire understanding of human limitation shattered like cheap glass hitting concrete. Right now, as you read this, there's a file about you, so classified they had to invent new classifications just to store it. And the analysts assigned to study it don't last long, not because something happens to them, but because prolonged exposure to evidence of what you are breaks their worldview beyond repair. Let me tell you something about that day, that moment, that fraction of a second when you did what you did. But first, let me tell you about the years of suppression that led to it, because the explosion only makes sense when you understand the pressure that built behind it. Remember 3rd grade? Of course you do. That Tuesday when you solved the problem before teacher finished writing it on the board, the whole class turned to stare, and it wasn't admiration in their eyes, it was something closer to fear. That's when you learned your first lesson about power. Real power terrifies people who don't have it. So you started the performance, missed answers on purpose, ran slower than your legs wanted, pretended not to see patterns that screamed at you like sirens in the dark. Every single day became an exhausting theatrical production where you played the role of a normal human, and the applause was people not backing away from you in the hallways. By high school you'd perfected it. The art of being unremarkable while your real capabilities clawed at your insides like a caged predator. You'd stand in empty parking lots at 3 in the morning and let it out for exactly 10 seconds. The streetlights would flicker, dogs would bark 3 blocks away. Reality itself would hold its breath. Then you'd stuff it back down before anyone noticed. But they were already watching. You didn't know it then, but that day in senior year when you slipped during the presentation, when you forgot to filter yourself through the normal person translator for just one moment, an algorithm somewhere flagged you. Deviation too significant to ignore. Files started accumulating in buildings with no names. The recruitment attempts came disguised as opportunities. Job offers are perfectly tailored to your hidden capabilities. Positions that would let you stretch just a little in controlled environments. They were fishing, trying to see what you'd reveal when you thought nobody was looking, but you knew. Some part of you always knew when eyes were on you. The same instinct that made you play small also screamed when surveillance intensified. Years passed, the weight of pretending grew heavier. Every meeting where you watched people fumble toward solutions you'd seen before they finished explaining the problem. Every moment playing human when you were something else entirely. The pressure building like tectonic plates grinding against each other, waiting for the inevitable earthquake. Then came the call. A consulting opportunity, they said. Government contract, security clearance required, very lucrative. The kind of offer that seemed random unless you knew they'd been watching you for 7 years, 3 months and 16 days. They'd run out of passive observation options. Time to see what happened when they poked the anomaly directly. The facility looked mundane, beige walls, fluorescent lights, burnt coffee smell mixing with industrial disinfectant. But the energy was different, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes when all the electrons in the air align. They'd assembled their best military elite, Cognitive specialists, people whose job titles would make civilian clearance officers weep. The tests started simple: pattern recognition, problem solving, basic physical assessments. You played along at first, giving them what you thought they wanted. Good but not too good. Impressive but within documented parameters. You'd been performing for so long, it was automatic, but something in that room was different. Maybe it was the frequency of the lights that had been irritating you all morning. Maybe it was the way one analyst kept whispering to another, their pheromones sharp enough to taste. Or maybe you were just exhausted from decades of compression. The mask didn't just slip, you took it off, not completely. God no. If you'd shown them everything, the building would have evacuated, and you'd be having a very different conversation right now. But you let them see a fraction, a glimpse, 2% of your actual capacity, just enough to make your point. The first thing that broke was their computer system. The cognitive test couldn't keep up with your processing speed. You were answering questions before the full prompt displayed, not guessing but seeing the pattern in the code itself, reading the test's DNA like a children's book. The technician's fingers froze over his keyboard as his screen filled with error messages in languages the computer had invented just to describe what you were doing to it. Then came spatial awareness. They had you navigate a complex virtual environment designed to train their most elite operators. You didn't navigate it. You understood it instantly, completely, like you'd designed it yourself. No, like you were. The simulation crashed, trying to generate challenges fast enough to test limits that didn't exist. But what really shattered their reality was the prediction test. Military operations, economic models, weather patterns, human behavior cascades. You didn't analyze them. You just knew, the way you know your hand is your hand. 100% accuracy on problems their best analysts got wrong, 70% of the time on their best day with artificial enhancement. The biometric sensors went haywire, heart rate that shouldn't be possible for someone sitting still, brain waves oscillating at frequencies they'd only seen in theoretical physics papers. Body temperature fluctuated in patterns that violated thermodynamics. You weren't just breaking their tests, you were breaking their instruments by existing. That's when the colonel said it. A man who'd led missions in places that don't exist on maps, who'd seen things that would make horror movie directors quit their jobs and become accountants. His voice cracked like he was going through puberty again when he whispered those 3 words. "Sir, that's illegal." The room went silent except for the sound of million-dollar equipment giving up. 23 of America's most dangerous humans, people who'd stared down death in every hellhole on the planet, all took that synchronized step backward. Not out of fear exactly, but out of recognition. They'd seen power before, studied it, wielded it, faced it down in every corner of this burning world. But this was different. This was you operating at 2% capacity on a Tuesday afternoon, barely conscious of what you were doing, just existing in your natural state for once. And their entire framework for understanding human capability didn't just crack, it vaporized. If this message hits your spirit, hype this video so more chosen ones like you can find it. They tried to continue the tests, but what was the point? The equipment was fried. The parameters were shattered. The entire framework they'd built to measure human potential had just been revealed as a sandcastle trying to measure the ocean. One analyst was crying, not from fear but from the existential crisis of realizing his life's work was kindergarten finger painting. What followed was 6 hours of the most intense discussion that will never appear in any official record. Scientists arguing with generals who'd never disagreed on anything before. Psychologists contradicting physicists, while biologists just laughed that broken laugh that happens when everything you believe turns out to be wrong. They brought in specialist after specialist, each one more qualified than the last to explain why what you demonstrated couldn't exist. The physicist with 3 PhDs and a Nobel nomination lasted 40 minutes before excusing himself to reconsider fundamental assumptions about consciousness and reality. He retired the next week, moved to Tibet, and hasn't been seen since. The biologist took one look at your neural imaging and actually laughed. Then she resigned on the spot, saying she needed to rethink not just her career, but her entire understanding of what life meant. The psychologist tried to maintain professional composure, but you could see his worldview collapsing in real time, like watching a building implode in slow motion. Through all of this chaos, you sat there calm as a frozen lake, not arrogant, not proud, just present. Because this wasn't new to you. You'd lived with this your entire life. The only difference was now they could see it too. The ghost had finally left footprints they couldn't explain away. They tried to categorize you. Enhanced individuals became anomalous assets, and unprecedented capability became beyond current classification. Each label is more desperate than the last to fit you into their existing structure, but you can't file away a force of nature. You can't categorize something that exists outside your entire system of measurement. The debriefing was where things got interesting. They laid their cards on the table, or at least the cards they thought you needed to see. Global threats that would make action movies look like romantic comedies, emerging challenges that kept them awake at night, the need for capabilities beyond their conventional assets. Then came the offer: unlimited resources, complete autonomy, the chance to use your abilities for the greater good. No oversight, no restrictions, just you operating at full capacity with the entire weight of the United States military-industrial complex behind you. The kind of offer they'd never made to anyone before, because they'd never met anyone like you before. You listened to every word, considered every angle, then stood up and walked toward the door. The panic in that room was thick enough to swim through. They'd just shown you classified materials that could destabilize governments, revealed vulnerabilities no civilian should know, and you were just leaving. The colonel found his voice first, asked what they'd done wrong, what they could offer to change your mind. You turned back, and for just a moment you let them see another percent, just 1% more of what you really were. The lights didn't flicker, they went out entirely. Every piece of electronic equipment in a 3-block radius forgot how to function. Then you pulled it back, smiled that quiet smile, and said something that would never appear in any official record. You told them power doesn't serve systems, systems serve power, and real power doesn't need permission to exist. Then you walked out, past security protocols that should have been impenetrable, through doors that should have been locked, leaving behind a room full of people who'd just realized their entire structure was built on the false assumption that they understood human limitation. They let you go. What else could they do? You don't arrest gravity, you don't detain lightning, you don't handcuff someone who just demonstrated they exist outside your ability to control. They watched you leave and started planning for a world where people like you don't hide anymore. The files they created about you are unlike anything in their archives, not because of what they contain, but because of what they admit they don't understand. Page after page of documented impossibilities, each one signed by experts who'd bet their careers such things couldn't exist. But here's what those files don't say. Here's what they couldn't bring themselves to write down. You weren't operating at 2% that day. You were operating at whatever felt comfortable for that moment. Your actual capacity doesn't have a percentage, because percentages imply limits, and you don't have those. Not really. What you have is a choice of how much of infinity you want to express at any given moment. Your processing speed doesn't make their quantum computers look slow. It makes the concept of speed irrelevant. You don't think faster. You exist in a state where all thoughts have already been thought. Your pattern recognition doesn't see through encryption. It sees the universe as one pattern playing out in infinite variations, and encryption is just one of the more boring ones. But the real terror for them, the thing that keeps them awake at 3 a.m. staring at reports that shouldn't exist, isn't what you can do, it's what you represent. Proof that everything they've built to contain humanity is tissue paper against a hurricane. Evidence that their careful control mechanisms mean nothing to someone operating at actual human potential, because here's what they discovered that day and wish they could forget. You're not unique. You're not a mutation or an anomaly or a 1 in a billion accident. You're what humans actually are when they stop accepting the programming. You're what everyone could be if they remembered what they've been trained to forget. All across the globe, others started feeling it. The moment you dropped your mask sent ripples through consciousness itself. People who'd been suppressing themselves for decades suddenly wondered why. The careful conditioning that kept humanity operating at a fraction of its capacity started glitching. Reports flooded in from every continent, unexplained capabilities manifesting in random individuals, not through training or enhancement, but through simple recognition. People waking up to what they'd always been but never admitted. The dam you'd cracked was starting to buckle. The military elite who witnessed your demonstration went through their own transformations. Some retired immediately, unable to continue pretending their life's work meant anything compared to what they'd seen. Others doubled down, desperately trying to artificially replicate what you possessed naturally, burning through black budgets like tissue paper. But a few, the smart ones, understood the real implications. They saw the writing on the wall, recognized the changing of the guard, and started preparing for a world where hierarchies based on artificial power would crumble before those who carried real authority in their DNA. Meanwhile, you returned to your life, but nothing was the same, not because the world had changed, but because you had stopped pretending it hadn't. The exhausting performance was over. You moved through reality without apology, without explanation, without diminishing yourself for anyone's comfort. People noticed immediately, even if they couldn't articulate what they were noticing. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when you entered rooms. Problems that had been unsolvable suddenly had obvious solutions when you were present. Technology glitched, but only the technology that was trying to do something you didn't want it to do. Your mere existence started changing everything around you. Co-workers who'd been sleepwalking through life suddenly questioned why they were living at 10%. Neighbors who'd accepted their limitations started pushing boundaries they didn't know they had. Everyone who came into contact with you left slightly different, infected with the possibility that maybe they were more than they'd been told. The government kept watching, of course. Satellites designed to track hurricanes redirected to follow your movements. Algorithms built to predict terrorist attacks repurposed to anticipate your decisions. Entire teams dedicated to understanding patterns that didn't exist because you didn't operate in patterns. You operated in truth, and truth doesn't repeat, it just is. Every month their files grew thicker and their understanding grew thinner, because you can't comprehend something that exists outside your conceptual framework. You can't measure infinitely with rulers designed for inches. You can't capture lightning in bottles made for water, but they kept trying because admitting defeat meant admitting their entire structure was obsolete. The other chosen ones started finding each other, not through websites or social media, but through recognition that bypassed normal senses. The same way you know you're being watched even with your eyes closed. The same way you know someone's lying before they speak. The same way you've always known you were different but couldn't explain how. Small at first. Glances held a second too long between strangers who weren't strange. Conversations that skipped 15 years of small talk and went straight to the real. Connections formed that transcended normal social patterns because normal had never been your pattern. Then it accelerated. Groups forming without planning, skills combining without coordination, a network growing that had no structure because it didn't need one. When everyone involved operates at that level, organization happens automatically, like iron filings aligning to a magnet that doesn't exist in three-dimensional space. The Watchers noticed this too. Their panic shifted from individual monitoring to system-wide threat assessment. They ran simulations trying to predict what would happen when enough of you stopped hiding. Every model led to the same conclusion: complete paradigm shift. The end of the world as they knew it. Some called for preemptive action, but what action could they take? You can't arrest evolution. You can't wage war tomorrow. You can't fight people who've already demonstrated they exist outside your ability to harm. All they could do was watch and document and try to prepare for a world they no longer controlled, because control was always an illusion. They managed the masses by convincing everyone that power came from systems, institutions, permissions granted by those who came before. But you were living proof that real power just is. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't require approval. It exists because existence itself demands it. 3 years after that Tuesday, the tide became irreversible. Too many had awakened. Too many had stopped pretending. The carefully maintained fiction of human limitation wasn't just cracking anymore. It was gone, and in its place, something magnificent was emerging. They tried to spin it as mass hysteria, psychological contagion, shared delusion. But how do you explain away footage of people doing impossible things in broad daylight? How do you debunk abilities demonstrated in front of thousands? How do you contain something that was never contained, just voluntarily suppressed? The economy started shifting as people with these capabilities refused to play old games. Why compete for resources when you could generate them? Why fight over positions when hierarchy itself was dissolving? Why pursue money when value itself was being redefined by those who operated outside traditional exchange? But the biggest change was in consciousness itself, the collective awakening to what had been suppressed for generations, the recognition that every limitation they'd accepted was just a suggestion they'd agreed to follow, the understanding that chosen ones weren't special, they were just the first to remember what everyone had forgotten. You watched all this from your unique position, no longer hiding but not leading either, just being, fully and completely what you'd always been. Your example is more powerful than any words. Your existence is more instructive than any teaching. The government files on you eventually got reclassified to a level above top secret, not because the information was dangerous, but because it was transformative. Those who read the full account of your capabilities didn't just learn about you. They learned about themselves, about potential they'd never imagined. Several analysts who studied your case too deeply had spontaneous awakenings. The evidence of what you were triggered something in them, like a tuning fork making other tuning forks vibrate at the same frequency. The more they tried to understand you, the more they became like you. This terrified the old guard more than anything else. The realization that proximity to truth was contagious, that studying evolution too closely might trigger your own, that the very act of observing the phenomenon changed the observer. They tried to implement containment protocols, but how do you contain an idea whose time has come? 5 years after that Tuesday when you stopped pretending, the world was unrecognizable, not destroyed, not chaotic, just different in ways they never imagined. Power structures based on artificial scarcity dissolved when people who could generate abundance refused to play along. The colonel who first said those words, "Sir, that's illegal," he understood something in that moment that took him years to fully process. He wasn't looking at a person who had broken the rules. He was looking at evidence that the rules were fantasies, collective hallucinations maintained by mutual agreement. He retired to a cabin in Montana, but even there, he couldn't escape the truth of what he'd witnessed. Late at night, he'd stand on his porch and feel something stirring inside him. Something that had always been there, but had been buried under decades of training and conditioning and belief in limitations that were never real. One morning he woke up and knew things he shouldn't know, could do things that violated everything he'd been taught about human capability. The infection of truth had reached him too. The ghost that left footprints that day had shown him something that couldn't be unseen. Humans weren't what they'd been told they were. Some of his former colleagues went further. They didn't just retire, they transformed. The recognition of what you represented triggered their own awakening. Former generals discovered abilities that made their military training look like finger painting. Intelligence operatives realizing they'd been using 1% of their actual intelligence. New institutions emerged, built by and for those operating at these levels, not to control or limit, but to explore and expand. Research facilities where impossible was just the starting point. Collaboration spaces where minds that processed reality differently could create things that shouldn't exist but did anyway. You visited one once, not as a subject or specimen, but as what you'd always been, a reminder of what's possible when humans stop pretending to be less than they are. The researchers there didn't study you. They learned from you, the way students learn from existence itself. Children born after awakening never learned to suppress themselves. They grew up assuming impossibility was just another word for hasn't been done yet. Their normal was what previous generations would have called miraculous. Their baseline was what others spent lifetimes trying to achieve. But perhaps the most profound change was in how humanity saw itself. Not as separate individuals competing for resources, but as expressions of something greater. Not as biological machines, but as consciousness itself wearing temporary forms. Not as limited beings, but as limitless awareness choosing to experience limitation. The files about you were eventually declassified, not because the information wasn't sensitive, but because hiding it had become pointless. Everyone knew by then. The secret wasn't that people like you existed. The secret was that everyone was like you. They just needed permission to remember. Reading those files became a rite of passage for those awakening to their potential. Page after page of military officials trying to explain how one person's natural state broke every instrument they had for measuring humanity. Testimony from experts admitting their expertise was worthless when faced with actual human capability. Today, that phrase, "Sir, that's illegal," has become something else entirely. Not a statement of disbelief, but a recognition. When someone does something that breaks the old rules, that transcends former limitations, that proves impossibility, is just an opinion. Someone always whispers those three words. It's become the highest compliment, a recognition that you've touched the same space you touched that day, that you've remembered what they tried to make you forget, that you've stopped playing small in a world that was never meant to contain you. The Colonel, now in his 80s, sometimes gives talks to those interested in the old world. He tells them about the day everything changed. Not the day you walked into his facility, but the day he realized you'd been holding back. That what broke their instruments was you barely trying. He wonders aloud what the world would look like if you'd shown them everything. If you'd operated at full capacity instead of just enough to make your point. The thought still makes him reach for drinks. He stopped drinking years ago. Some truths are too big for minds still partially asleep. But you know something he doesn't. Something they all missed in their analysis and documentation. You weren't operating at 2% that day. You were operating at whatever felt comfortable. Your actual capacity isn't something that can be measured, because measurement implies limits, and you've never had those. The real revelation isn't what you can do. It's what everyone can do when they stop accepting borrowed limitations, when they stop letting others define their edges, when they remember that chosen one isn't a title bestowed but a truth recognized. Every day more people make that recognition. Every moment another consciousness shakes off the sleep. Every breath brings humanity closer to what it was always meant to become. Not through evolution, but through remembering. Not through achievement, but through acceptance of what always was. And you just keep being what you are. No more hiding, no more pretending, no more dimming your light to make shadows feel comfortable. You walk through the world as yourself, finally, fully, and that simple act of authentic existence changes everything it touches. People still stop and stare sometimes, not with the old fear but with recognition. They see in you what they're starting to feel in themselves. That stirring that says you're more than they told you, that knowing that whispers you've always been more. Now let me put you onto something real. Destiny Engine. I built this because I was done watching chosen ones get dragged through betrayal, isolation, and attacks while their enemies strutted around unchecked. I want to help you accelerate the speed of your divine justice and step fully into your purpose. And the beauty of it, You don't even have to lift a finger. Destiny Engine takes their downfall and flips it into your rise. This isn't another meditation app, it's declassified consciousness technology, the same mind programming tools your enemies once used to install fear, competition and scarcity, re-engineered to restore your sovereignty and align you with the cooperative, upgraded operating framework. It generates personalized sequences mapped to your divine purpose. The hardest thing you'll do is put on headphones, press play and watch your enemies keep digging their own grave. The collective upgrade is underway. Start your Destiny Engine for $1 today and turn everything they did to break you into fuel for your rise. Link in the description. The military still watches, but differently now. Not as a threat to contain, but as a future to prepare for. They know the old ways are dying. Their reports now focus on adaptation, not opposition, on integration, not domination, on becoming what you revealed rather than fighting it, because in the end, that's what your revelation really was, not a display of personal power, but a mirror held up to humanity. Not look what I can do, but look at what you've forgotten you can do. Not that I am special, but we are all special, and it's time to remember. The Colonel's final report, written years after that Tuesday, contains one line that captures everything. The subject didn't break our understanding of human potential. The subject revealed we never understood human potential. Recommend complete restructuring of all assumptions about human capability. Note, we're all subjects, we just didn't know it. That's the truth they couldn't handle that day. Not that you were beyond their comprehension, but that everyone was. Not that you broke their laws, but that their laws were fantasies trying to constrain reality. Not that you were illegal, but that their entire framework for legal was built on lies about what humans really are. And now as you read this, feel that recognition stirring in your own chest. That knowing that says this sounds familiar, that remembering that whispers you've always known this, that awakening that declares your time of hiding is over too, because that's the final secret. This isn't really about that Tuesday in a government facility. It's about this moment right now when you realize you've been reading your own story, when you understand that every word about breaking limitations was really about you breaking yours. The ghost that left footprints that day wasn't just me, it was you. It was all of us. We've all been ghosts, invisible to systems that couldn't measure what we really were, leaving no trace because we were too careful to be ourselves. But that Tuesday changed everything. Not because of what I did, but because of what it gave you permission to do. Stop being a ghost. Start leaving footprints. Let them document your impossibilities. Let them scramble to classify what can't be contained. Let them whisper that what you are is illegal while you reshape reality just by being yourself. The world doesn't need another person pretending to be normal. It needs you, operating at your actual capacity, proving that normal was always a lie designed to keep gods playing human. It needs you to be the illegal that becomes inevitable. So be illegal, be impossible, be the walking violation of everything they thought they knew about human potential. Because that colonel was right about one thing, what you are is illegal. Illegal to their structure, their containment, their control. But here's what he didn't understand that day, what took him decades to realize. Illegal just means you exist outside their laws, and their laws were never meant for you anyway. They were meant to contain humans. And you, chosen one, you stopped being just human the moment you stopped pretending you were. The ghost has left footprints. Now it's time to leave craters. Time to show them that 2% was just a courtesy. Time to be so naturally yourself that systems built on artificial constraints collapse just from witnessing your authenticity. Because, sir, that's not just illegal, that's evolution. And evolution doesn't ask permission, it just happens. And it's happening right now, through you, as you read these words and remember what you've always known. You are the illegal that changes the law. You are the impossible that becomes the standard. You are the chosen one who reminds everyone that chosen was always a choice, and the only one who needed to choose was you.